Hello, my name's Danielle Schreve and I am a professor in quaternary science in the Department of Geography at Royal Holloway. But actually what I really do is work as a paleontologist working on Ice Age mammals.
So the concept of this video is sort of about conservation palaeobiology. So could you begin by telling us what that is, please?
So conservation paleobiology is really an emerging discipline, and what it attempts to do is to the full record from fossils, but also from historical records to establish better baselines for conservation issues today. So, for example, some of the things that we might think about are conserving species in habitats where they might be endangered today. And because our current ecological records are fairly short term, one of the mistakes we might make is thinking that that is the only place, or indeed the best place, that we could conserve these endangered species. And actually, if you go further back in time, it allows you to identify the fact that these species may have now been retracting into a range that is actually quite unsuitable for it. So the fossil record allows you to build a much more confident baseline to be able to do that.
So can you give any maybe examples of how research on the Pleistocene fossil record is used to inform conservation today?
So this can be important in several different ways. So one of the things that we understand now is, for example, the really significant effect that megaherbivores in the past have had on ecosystems. So, for example, it was very common in Britain to have different species of rhino, elephant, and on occasion hippo. And it doesn't mean that this was like sub-Saharan Africa in warm stages in the past. This was completely normal for the British landscape, found in association with the kinds of mixed oak and beech woodlands that we would find today. And those large herbivores had a really significant effect. So partly by opening up the vegetation, which then allows different species to come in and to keep those areas open, but also by reducing things like woody biomass on the landscape, which would be a source of fuel for fire. They were important in terms of moving nutrients around. So particularly, for example, through transporting seeds in their coat, for example. So important effects for ecosystems, but also other ways that we can see. So species that, as I've mentioned, have become very endangered today, we know that actually they were much more widespread in the past. So those kinds of evidences can be brought in by understanding more about their range, the types of environments that they were associated with, the types of prey species they occurred with if they were a predator, and the types of competition that they encountered. So this kind of thing can be brought in from the fossil record. The final thing really is also about how we define native species. So today we are often in a position where we might accord native species a greater degree of protection. And that's because we perceive them to be important in terms of our natural ecosystems. One of the things that our work has is, however, that there are species that we didn't appreciate as being native, i.e. being here at the start of the Holocene or the warm stage that we're in now, and actually understanding that those are real species that should be part of the British landscape and actually should be accorded that kind of special protection in terms of their status as well. So lots of different ways that we can bring in evidence from the fossil record.
Can you tell us a bit about your current research focus?
In terms of current research focus, I'm really interested at the moment in how species have responded to really abrupt climate change, particularly over the last 50,000 years. So this represents a part of time that goes from the middle part of the last ice age really up to the early parts of the current warm stage that we're in now. And certainly for ice age environments, I think there's a common misconception that these were uniformly cold, but actually we know from looking at very detailed climate records that they mark really abrupt and very rapid climatic oscillations. So one of the real challenges is understanding how species, particularly mammals, which is the thing that I work on, how they responded to these challenges in terms of moving their range, perhaps adapting, or in some cases going extinct, so dying out either locally or becoming completely extinct. And much of the research that I do goes on in cave sites down in the southwest of the UK, but also in the English Midlands, because that's where there are great records that are often built up over long periods of time and which chart how these animal communities responded. And I think the big message for us is actually that these communities were constantly in flux. What we see out in the landscape today is not fixed in time. These communities moved, different species arrived, different species come and go. And that's a really significant message, I think, when we think of species today, that we need to understand that, it's not always been completely fixed and rigid. So we can learn a lot from the past. And that's really where a lot of my research attention is focused. And that information itself can then be used for conservation paleobiology purposes. So actually working with practitioners, working with conservation specialists and giving them information on ecological resilience of species in the past.
So I think you've nicely led on to my next question then. So can you give any specific examples of conservation based on Pleistocene research in Britain?
So some active things that are ongoing. So for example, I've got a big project funded by the Natural Environment Research Council that is looking into ecological resilience in wolves. And we're doing that through the means of looking at their past diet and looking at different kinds of proxies or different types of records for understanding that. And that can range from records that take quite a long time for change to be seen. So for example, evolutionary changes in the teeth and jaws, but really short-term records. So for example, looking at microscopic wear scratches and pits on the surface of the teeth, which show essentially the last few meals that the animal consumed before its death. So there's a whole sort of spectrum in terms of the different types of evidence that we can deploy. And what we're doing is looking at records from both warm stages in the past. So sometimes times when climate was as warm as today, sometimes even warmer. We're looking at records from times when environments were open or when environments were mostly closed woodland. We're looking at periods when wolves had different competitors around. So those might have been things like spotted hyenas or bears or cave lions, for example. And we're looking at how wolves have flexed their diet, but also things like their body mass as well, and how they've switched from different prey sources depending on the climate and the environment. And we're working with wolf biologists out in Sweden, Poland, and Croatia, both to learn from them about how the modern evidence helps us to interpret the paleo record, but also giving them insights into how wolves responded, for example, to warmer temperatures in the past. So that's something that is actively ongoing.
Do you have any more examples outside of Britain?
So there are some great examples from outside Britain. In fact, one of my favourite examples comes from Australia, and it is with something called a mountain pygmy possum. So this is a very tiny and cute marsupial. And it's really endangered today. It in isolated populations in alpine, so mountain environments in the southeast of Australia. And it's a real target for conservation because obviously it's so few in numbers and it's really struggling in the environments in which it finds itself today. And again, it comes back to this point about our misconceptions if we just look at the modern record, because actually these animals are really ill suited to being in alpine environments, but it's the only place because of marginalisation of their habitats, loss of habitats because of human activity, it's the only place that they've been able to survive. So if we decide to conserve them there, we are probably going to drive them to extinction. But instead, what Australian colleagues have done is to go back into the fossil record, even going back millions of years. They have identified that members of this mountain pygmy possum or the pygmy possum family were previously distributed for millions of years across lowland, wetland environments, so completely different to where they live today. So what they're doing is actually captive breeding populations and then translocating them to areas that are the best approximation for where they thrived in the past, so even millions of years ago. So they're translocating them to these lowland, wetland environments. and they're going to be habituating them and then releasing them there in the hope that that will actually allow the species to survive. So that's been a really powerful, I guess, a really powerful example of how the fossil record can give you a completely different insight into where a species or a group of species should actually be distributed. And that can be really a sort of a really effective way of implementing in terms of conservation policy.
Bringing it back to Britain, just to finish off, what are your visions for a conservation-focused Britain?
So I guess one of the things that I have been trying to do is to work with a lot of, or start more work with a lot of practitioners and landowners to look at what they really need in terms of information going forward to establish better baseline evidence. So some of the things that are sort of active future projects are things like tied to the rewilding agenda. So, for example, the reintroduction of large herbivores. So I'm involved in monitoring a group of bison that have been introduced to the Blean woodland in northern Kent. And that's in association with the Kent Wildlife Trust, but also the Wildwood Trust. And we are working to look at the diet, so sort of seasonal changes in diet, how those bison move around the woodland, they start to open up the woodland, and whether this is going to impact biodiversity. So the introduction of European bison has been really successful on the continent, for example, in the Netherlands, in Denmark, and I think there are really positive potential for having them back in Britain. Again, there's a lot of things that we have to overcome because these animals are covered under the Dangerous Wild Animals Act in the UK, whereas they are not treated at all in the same way. They're actually rather placid. They're not treated in the same way at all in continental Europe. So I think if we were able to bring back more large grazers to have a more sort of naturalistic type of grazing regime, that would be amazing. Equally, I think there's some really exciting opportunities for introducing other types of sort of mid-sized predators. I think it's very unlikely we will ever have wolves or brown bear back in the UK, but certainly things like lynx, they are being obviously for potential reintroduction. We've already seen the success of things like beavers coming back into Britain in terms of providing a completely cost-free way of mitigating against floods. So those are possible. Things like Dalmatian pelican in wetlands, they used to be around in up until the middle part of this interglacial and then disappeared from Britain. They would be a great thing to bring back. And also some other things like the most endangered carnivore that we have in Britain today is the wildcat. It's living up in Scotland today in upland environments, again, in a very marginal habitat. But until just a few hundred years ago, they were perfectly happy down in, deciduous woodlands in the south. And again, I think we need to think about sort of bringing them back down to be an important part of those woodland ecosystems. So that would be my vision, actually, more sort of naturalistic element. I think there's real possibilities with, for example, these super national nature reserves that have been created, the linking up of different habitats to allow corridors for movement of species, and the reinstigation of wetlands as well, not only for carbon capture, but also for biodiversity benefits as well. So hopefully lots of exciting rewilding opportunities in the future.
I hope your vision comes true because that sounds brilliant.
Thank you.